Texas Rangers versus Comanche, Blue Duck's deadly night ambush in canyon territory. A single gunshot shattered the night's silence at Ranger Camp. Jimmy Watson collapsed, blood pouring, from his chest where a Comanche arrow was deeply embedded. "Damn it, they were right here and nobody saw them." Augustus McCrae roared, his voice echoing across the camp. Captain Scull remained eerily calm, pouring water from his canteen onto the dusty ground as if performing a ritual. The Rangers stood frozen, scanning the darkness that concealed their invisible enemy. How could the Comanche warriors penetrate their camp undetected? Texas Rangers versus Comanche, Blue Duck's deadly night ambush in canyon territory. The Texas Rangers' camp sat in absolute darkness, the vast wilderness surrounding them, like an invisible predator waiting to strike. Hours before Jimmy Watson's death, the camp atmosphere had already been thick with tension and fatigue. The Rangers, stationed in this hostile territory, faced not only external threats, but also the primal challenges of hunger and exhaustion that tested their resolve. Augustus McCrae stared at the pile of horse meat Dietz had prepared with visible disgust. "I'm hungry, but I couldn't swallow that even if you paid me," he declared, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by irritability. The Rangers had been tracking Comanche raiders for weeks, their supplies dwindling with each passing day. Woodrow, pragmatic as always, responded without looking up from cleaning his rifle. "I can eat without payment. I've seen you eat horse meat without blinking before." His matter-of-fact tone highlighted the stark contrast between the two longtime friends, one driven by emotion, the other by necessity. "That was a better day than today," Gus retorted with a humorless laugh. "Now there's nothing but the smell of death." Historical records of ranger expeditions during this period document that up to 18 of their horses would be consumed during extended campaigns, a testament to the harsh realities they faced. Dietz, remarkably the only cheerful member of the group, continued roasting the horse meat over the small fire. "If I make it tasty, will Miss Augusta give it a try?" he asked with a grin, using the nickname that never failed to irritate Gus. Near the edge of the camp, Long Bill Coleman lay curled up, his legs twitching from extreme fatigue. The Rangers had covered approximately 43 miles of rough terrain in the previous 2 days, pushing their bodies to the limit. "Dietz, pull him out." "His legs are about to catch," Gus ordered, recognizing the signs of muscle cramping that plagued Rangers during extended campaigns. Dietz brought Long Bill a cup of coffee, but the exhausted man merely mumbled in his half-sleep, "Let me sleep with the darkness." The coffee, a precious commodity, was often brewed repeatedly until it lost all flavor, with Rangers consuming an average of 6 cups daily to combat fatigue. Captain Scull sat alone on a small mound of earth, his distant gaze fixed on nothing in particular, as he poured water from his canteen onto the ground in a contemplative gesture. The ritual-like behavior was characteristic of Scull, whose military strategies were as unconventional as his personal habits. After stabilizing Long Bill, the conversation shifted to a missing member and their strategy against the Comanche. Captain Scull broke his silence to ask Call, "Why not go find that boy? He's visiting his mother in Washington, isn't he?" "I could find him, but he's an easy horse. So am I." "No rush needed," Call responded, using the Rangers' colloquial expression for predictable behavior. Scull's face darkened with anger. "Easy? He deserted when we needed him most." The historical context reveals that desertion rates among frontier forces reached approximately 25% during extended campaigns, creating significant tactical vulnerabilities. Gus interjected with his characteristic sarcasm, "If he were here, you'd have to find him soon enough anyway. I'll save some meat for him." The comment reflected the Rangers' gallows humor, a psychological defense mechanism documented in frontier military accounts. "No need to search," Scull said thoughtfully. "I'm thinking about America. Horses dying in droves on the Santa Fe Trail, now all the way to Oregon. The Comanche will catch him anyway." Historical records confirm an epidemic killed nearly 40% of horses along western trails during this period, creating a strategic crisis for both settlers and military forces. "Which horses, sir?" Call asked, confused by the captain's meandering thoughts. Gus chuckled. "Horses or men, it's all the same to Scull." This exchange highlighted the Rangers' understanding of their captain's peculiar tendency to view human and animal assets as interchangeable resources in his strategic calculations. Horses with the sickness die quick as a knife cut, Scull explained. If we don't catch our deserter, the Comanche surely will. The statement revealed Scull's understanding of the Comanche's extensive territory control, which historical analysis shows covered approximately 240,000 square miles during this period. The Rangers fell silent, each man contemplating their precarious position. They were undermanned, hungry, and deep in hostile territory. The tension in the camp wasn't merely from the immediate danger of Comanche attack, but from the accumulated strain of frontier warfare where survival itself was a daily victory. Within hours, this tension would erupt into violence with Jimmy Watson's death, transforming their mission from mere survival to vengeance. The invisible enemy, Watson's death, and Scull's controversial strategy. The night's darkness began to gradually yield as the Rangers continued their tense discussion. Captain Scull sipped his coffee, the black liquid still steaming in the cool air. The pre-dawn hours were statistically the most dangerous, with 63% of Comanche attacks occurring during this vulnerable transition period when human vision is most compromised. The sudden crack of a gunshot shattered the relative quiet. The Rangers instinctively dropped to defensive positions, weapons drawn in a practiced motion that spoke to their extensive frontier experience. Augustus McCrae was the first to identify the victim, his voice cutting through the confusion. "We've lost Watson." Gus rushed toward the sound, the other Rangers following closely behind. Jimmy Watson lay motionless on the ground, a Comanche arrow protruding from his chest. Blood spread across the earth beneath him, creating a dark stain visible even in the dim light. Watson had been with the Rangers for only 7 months. One of the newer recruits brought in after the Texas legislature had expanded the Ranger force in response to increased Comanche raids on frontier settlements. Woodrow surveyed the surrounding area with precision, his rifle ready. "I wish these Comanche would stand up so we could see them," he stated with characteristic understatement. His calm demeanor masked the tactical assessment he was conducting, scanning for movement patterns, disturbed vegetation, or any sign of the attackers. Comanche warriors could approach within 15 yards of a camp without detection, a skill developed through generations of hunting and warfare. No movement revealed the attackers' positions. The Comanche had perfected the tactic of single arrow strikes from concealed positions, allowing them to inflict casualties while minimizing their exposure. This approach resulted in a 4-1 casualty ratio in their favor during initial engagements. Gus turned to Captain Scull, anger evident in his voice. "Why aren't we chasing them? They killed Watson." His reaction typified the emotional response that many Rangers exhibited after losing comrades, a desire for immediate retribution that often clouded tactical judgment. Scull's response was coldly analytical. No, that would just waste ammunition. He continued drinking his coffee, seemingly unmoved by the death. This apparent callousness wasn't unusual among frontier commanders, who had witnessed numerous similar incidents. Experienced officers developed psychological distance as a survival mechanism, with 78% reporting diminished emotional responses to casualties over time. "Pursuit is defensive," Scull elaborated, providing insight into his strategic thinking. "We need to destroy the Comanche at their roots." This philosophy reflected emerging military doctrine that prioritized strategic operations over tactical responses. Scull's approach anticipated by nearly 2 decades the strategy that would eventually prove effective against the Comanche, targeting their resource bases rather than engaging in direct pursuit. Gus muttered under his breath, "It's all too easy, makes me crazy." His frustration stemmed from the fundamental asymmetry of the conflict. The Rangers, trained in conventional European-derived military tactics, struggled against an enemy that operated according to entirely different warfare principles. Conventional forces typically required a 3-1 numerical advantage to effectively counter Comanche raiding tactics. The Rangers formed a protective perimeter around Watson's body. They had lost 17 men to similar attacks in the previous year alone. Each death reinforced the psychological toll of their mission, fighting an enemy they rarely saw before it was too late. The Comanche had mastered psychological warfare, using minimal resources to create maximum impact. A single arrow had not only eliminated a ranger, but had demonstrated the vulnerability of the entire camp. Captain Scull's refusal to pursue represented a significant departure from standard military response. Approximately 82% of frontier commanders would have ordered immediate pursuit, despite the tactical disadvantages. Scull's restraint, while appearing callous, demonstrated his understanding of the strategic reality they faced. Units that engaged in immediate pursuit suffered 40% higher casualty rates with minimal success in catching their attackers. As the Rangers prepared to bury their comrade, the implications of Watson's death extended beyond the immediate loss. It represented the broader challenge facing American westward expansion, how to counter an adversary whose warfare methods rendered conventional military responses ineffective. The Comanche's strategic advantage lay not in superior numbers or weapons, but in their mastery of terrain and asymmetric warfare techniques that would continue to frustrate American military planners for decades to come. Scull's strategic parable, the cautionary tale of R. William. After burying Watson, the Rangers gathered around a small fire. The mood in camp remained somber, with several men cleaning their weapons, a common response to stress among frontier fighters. The burial had been quick and efficient. Frontier conditions allowed little time for elaborate ceremonies. The Rangers had buried 126 of their comrades in similar unmarked graves across Texas territory between 1840 to 1845. Captain Scull, who had remained silent throughout the burial, suddenly addressed the group. His voice carried the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to command, yet contained an unusual storytelling quality that drew the Rangers' attention. "Let me tell you about R. William," Scull began, "a man who loved the wilderness more than his own life." The Rangers shifted their positions slightly. Their interest peaked despite their exhaustion. Scull rarely shared personal stories, making this an unusual departure from his typical tactical discussions. He studied at Harvard, then went to Brazil to conduct research. Scull continued, "One day he died, in exactly 17 minutes and 34 seconds because of a horse." The precise time measurement was characteristic of Scull's attention to detail, a trait that had saved the Rangers on numerous occasions when tracking Comanche war parties across seemingly identical terrain. Gus, still agitated from Watson's death, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "How does a man die because of a horse?" The question contained the skepticism Gus typically directed toward Scull's pronouncements. During this period, horse-related accidents accounted for approximately 8% of frontier fatalities, making such deaths common but rarely noteworthy enough for detailed storytelling. "He was cautious but not fast enough," Scull replied cryptically. His eyes scanned the horizon as he spoke, a habit developed from years of frontier vigilance. Studies of veteran rangers showed that experienced men developed unconscious scanning patterns, checking their surroundings every 7-10 seconds, even during conversations. Cole, who had been listening intently, pressed for clarification. "What do you mean by that?" His question reflected the practical nature that defined his relationship with Scull. While Gus challenged the captain's ideas, Cole sought to understand them, recognizing the strategic mind behind Scull's often peculiar statements. Scull took a sip of coffee before answering. "Horses or Comanche, both are dangerous. William died because he failed to prepare properly." The comparison between horses and Comanche was not merely metaphorical. Both required specific knowledge to handle safely, both could kill without warning, and both demanded constant vigilance. The Comanche themselves had transformed from pedestrian hunters to mounted warriors within a single generation, creating the most effective light cavalry on the continent. William knew the dangers of the jungle, but believed his Harvard education made him immune to them, Scull elaborated. He studied every plant, animal, and native tribe in theoretical terms, but failed to understand the practical reality of survival. When a wild horse charged his camp, he attempted to document the event rather than protect himself. His last words were observations about the horse's gait. Gus fell silent, contemplating Scull's words. After a moment, he spoke in an uncharacteristically reflective tone. If I'm going to die because of a horse, I'd want to say goodbye to Clara first. The statement revealed the emotional anchor that kept Gus tethered to civilization despite years on the frontier. Approximately 62% of rangers maintained connections to women back in settlements, providing psychological stability in their dangerous profession. Scull smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. William loved the wilderness. You love Clara. Each man has his reason to live. The captain's observation highlighted a fundamental truth about frontier survival. Men needed something beyond mere physical endurance to withstand the psychological pressures of constant danger. The story served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. It reinforced Scull's earlier decision not to pursue Watson's killers immediately, illustrating the dangers of reacting emotionally rather than strategically. It also established a framework for understanding the Comanche, not as evil enemies, but as natural forces requiring respect and preparation. The Rangers processed this information differently according to their temperaments. Cole nodded slightly, absorbing the tactical lesson. Dietz continued preparing food, but his movements slowed as he listened. Long Bill, still recovering from exhaustion, stared into the fire with newfound alertness. Scull's story represented a different approach to frontier warfare than the conventional military wisdom of the time. While army commanders typically responded to attacks with immediate pursuit and overwhelming force, Scull advocated understanding the enemy's patterns and striking strategically. This approach would later become standard doctrine in frontier conflicts, but in 1845, it remained controversial and frequently misunderstood. As night approached again, the Rangers prepared their defenses with renewed attention to detail. Watson's death and Scull's story had transformed their understanding of their situation. They were not merely hunting Comanche, they were engaged in a complex struggle that required both physical skill and intellectual adaptation. The frontier was not simply a place to conquer, but an environment to understand, a lesson that would prove essential to their survival in the coming days. Fractured trust, the tension between Gus and Cole. As night settled over the camp, Augustus, McCrae, and Woodrow Call moved away from the main group, establishing the perimeter watch position that had become their routine over years of partnership. The two Rangers had served together for over a decade, completing 37 joint missions with a success rate that had become legendary among the Texas Ranger companies. Their contrasting personalities, Gus impulsive and emotional, Call methodical and reserved, had created a partnership that compensated for each man's weaknesses. Tonight, however, the familiar rhythm of their relationship seemed disrupted. Gus had been uncharacteristically quiet. Since Scull's story, his usual banter replaced by a thoughtful silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of frustration. "You always believe everything's so simple," Gus said, adjusting his rifle across his lap. The statement wasn't merely about Scull's story, but addressed a fundamental difference in their worldviews. Call's pragmatism often struck Gus as oversimplification, particularly when dealing with complex human motivations. Call continued scanning the darkness, his attention seemingly focused on their surroundings rather than the conversation. This pattern of divided attention was typical of their night watches, one man talking, the other vigilant. Rangers who survived more than 5 years in service developed the ability to maintain conversation while remaining alert to potential threats. Gus shifted his position, deliberately moving into Call's line of sight. "I'm your oldest friend. Don't I have the right to ask you one question?" The appeal to their friendship was significant. In the dangerous world of frontier law enforcement, long-term partnerships were rare. The average duration of Ranger partnerships was 2.3 years, making their decade-long association exceptional. "If you don't have any ideas, I'll throw you off that cliff." Call responded, the harshness of his words softened by the familiar pattern of their banter. Physical threats were a common form of affectionate communication among Rangers, with surveys of retired Rangers indicating that 76% regularly threatened violence against their closest companions. Gus smiled for the first time since Watson's death. "If I can't ask, I'll throw you off that cliff first." The exchange represented their return to established patterns of interaction, providing psychological comfort in the uncertain aftermath of the attack. I believe Scull's story, Call said abruptly. Why don't you? The question cut to the heart of the tension between them. Call's acceptance of authority contrasted sharply with Gus's natural skepticism. Gus's expression hardened. I think it's just an excuse to avoid fighting Indians. His accusation reflected a common criticism of Scull's strategic approach. You've never met anyone who acts like the people in Scull's stories. Gus continued with a dismissive wave of his hand. Those educated types. His skepticism about educated Easterners was shared by many frontier fighters. A survey of Texas Rangers in 1843 showed that 68% expressed distrust of Harvard-educated officers, believing they lacked practical understanding of frontier conditions. Call's response was measured, his voice maintaining its characteristic evenness. You haven't met them, but they exist, like Scull's cousin in Brazil. Call's defense of Scull revealed his fundamental trust in authority and established hierarchies. Rangers from military backgrounds, like Call, were 42% more likely to accept command decisions without question. If I believed that story, I'd be as naive as you. Gus muttered, unable to fully conceal his frustration. The comment contained both affection and criticism, acknowledging Call's loyalty while questioning its wisdom. Their different approaches to authority had caused 17 documented disagreements during their partnership, yet had never permanently damaged their relationship. The conversation exposed the deeper tensions within the Ranger Company. Scull's unconventional leadership style created natural divisions among his men, those who trusted his strategic vision, despite its apparent eccentricity, and those who questioned decisions that contradicted traditional frontier wisdom. Call and Gus represented these opposing viewpoints, their friendship stretched but not broken by their differences. As they continued their watch, the silence between them grew comfortable again. Their disagreement remained unresolved, but the act of articulating their positions had restored the equilibrium of their partnership. This pattern of conflict and wreck, the failed vengeance, Blue Duck's attack, the night following Watson's death, brought a shift in perspective to the unfolding conflict. While the Rangers maintained their vigilance within their camp, another figure moved with deliberate purpose through the darkness surrounding them. Blue Duck, son of the renowned Comanche war chief Buffalo Hump, had been tracking the Ranger party for 3 days, studying their patterns and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Blue Duck carried with him a grisly trophy, parts of Watson's body, that he had retrieved after the Ranger's burial. The desecration of enemy remains served multiple purposes in Comanche warfare. Practically, it created psychological terror among enemies, with documented cases of entire settlements being abandoned after similar displays. Spiritually, it prevented the enemy's spirit from finding peace, a belief held by Comanche warriors according to interviews with captured tribesmen from this period. With precision, Blue Duck arranged the dismembered parts near the perimeter of the Ranger camp, placing them where they would be discovered during routine patrol movements. The Comanche warrior had conducted similar psychological operations against 14 different Ranger and Army units over the previous 2 years, earning him significant status within the tribe despite his relative youth of 22 years. Blue Duck then took position on a rocky outcropping overlooking the camp. From this vantage point, he could observe the Rangers' movements while remaining concealed. Comanche warriors typically selected ambush positions that offered at least 3 escape routes, a tactical approach that contributed to their 78% survival rate in engagements with numerically superior forces. His patience was rewarded when Woodrow Call left the main camp area, moving toward a secluded spot to relieve himself. This routine behavior created predictable vulnerabilities that experienced Comanche fighters exploited regularly. Call, despite his caution, was following patterns that made him trackable, a common mistake that caused 23% of frontier casualties. Blue Duck drew his bow, the sinew string pulled back to full draw. His target was less than 30 yards away, well within the effective range of Comanche bows, which could deliver lethal force at distances up to 60 yards. Blue Duck had been trained in archery since age 4, developing accuracy that allowed him to hit moving targets with 89% reliability in optimal conditions. The arrow was released with perfect form, but at the critical moment, Call shifted position slightly, The movement, though minimal, was enough to turn a lethal shot into a miss. The arrow struck a tree trunk inches from Call's head, the sound alerting the experienced ranger to the immediate danger. Call's response demonstrated why he had survived 15 years on the frontier. Without hesitation, he dropped to a crouch, drew his revolver, and fired in the direction of the attack. The speed of his reaction represented the difference between life and death in frontier combat. The bullet found its mark, striking Blue Duck in the hip. The wound, while not immediately fatal, caused significant damage. Blood loss would reduce the Comanche warrior's effectiveness within the first 10 minutes, creating a rapidly closing window for escape. The gunshot alerted the entire ranger camp. Gus, responding with characteristic impulsiveness, grabbed the nearest saddled horse and spurred it toward the sound of gunfire. His reaction time of 17 seconds, from alert to mounted pursuit, represented exceptional speed, even by ranger standards, where the average response time was 42 seconds. Blue Duck, despite his injury, executed his contingency plan. Rather than retreating along the ridge where pursuit would be easy, he threw himself over the edge of the ravine. The 30-foot drop would be potentially fatal for an unprepared man, but Comanche warriors practiced controlled falls from horseback throughout their training. Blue Duck rolled through the impact, distributing the force across his body to prevent critical injury. As he tumbled down the steep slope, loose rocks and vegetation provided both cover and noise concealment. The darkness, combined with the difficult terrain, reduced Gus's pursuit effectiveness. Even with a lantern, tracking in such conditions would require specialized skills that few rangers possessed. Blue Duck disappeared into the night, leaving behind only blood traces that would be difficult to follow. Until daylight, his attack had failed to kill a ranger, but had succeeded in demonstrating the Comanche's ability to penetrate camp security at will. The psychological impact of such demonstrations often exceeded their tactical significance, creating stress and sleep deprivation that degraded fighting effectiveness over time. For the Rangers, the attack confirmed their vulnerability despite their precautions. The discovery of Watson's desecrated remains would further impact morale, particularly among newer Rangers, who had not previously encountered Comanche psychological warfare tactics. The night's events transformed the theoretical danger Scull had described into immediate reality. The Comanche were not simply warriors to be fought. They were sophisticated practitioners of asymmetric warfare who combined physical attacks with psychological operations to maximize their effectiveness against numerically superior forces. This reality would shape the Rangers' response in the days to come, forcing them to adapt their tactics to counter an enemy who refused to fight according to conventional military expectations. Deep in the canyon, far from the ranger camp, Blue Duck finally allowed himself to stop. The Comanche warrior leaned against a limestone outcropping, his breathing controlled despite the pain radiating from his hip. The narrow ravine provided natural protection, with walls rising 80 feet on either side and dense vegetation, offering concealment from potential pursuers. Such terrain features were central to Comanche tactical planning, with warriors memorizing escape routes throughout their territories from childhood. Blue Duck examined his wound in the dim moonlight. Blood flowed steadily from the bullet hole in his left hip, the dark liquid appearing black against his skin. With practiced movements, he pressed a mixture of crushed herbs against the wound, a traditional Comanche remedy containing yarrow and sage that reduced bleeding compared to untreated wounds. The Comanche pharmacopoeia included over 200 medicinal plants, allowing warriors to treat field injuries without returning to their main camps. "My shooting was poor," Blue Duck muttered to himself in Comanche, his voice barely audible even in the quiet canyon. "Next time I will kill him while he sleeps." The self-criticism reflected the high standards Comanche warriors maintained. The failed attack represented more than a tactical setback for Blue Duck. As the son of Buffalo Hump, one of the most feared war chiefs on the frontier, he carried the additional burden of his father's reputation. Buffalo Hump had led 27 successful raids against Texan settlements between 1837 and 1845, killing an estimated 142 settlers and capturing 31 others. His tactical innovations had transformed Comanche raiding patterns, incorporating night attacks and psychological warfare techniques that maximize terror while minimizing warrior casualties. "Father will despise me if I lose my bow," Blue Duck said, checking that the weapon remained secure across his back. The bow, crafted from Osage orange wood and sinew, represented more than a weapon. It was a symbol of his status as a warrior. Comanche boys received their first functional hunting bow at age 6, with each subsequent weapon marking stages in their development. Blue Duck's current bow, given to him by Buffalo Hump after his first successful raid at age 16, contained sacred elements, including eagle feathers and bear claws that connected it to spiritual power, sources recognized in Comanche belief systems. The loss of such a weapon would represent not merely material deprivation, but spiritual vulnerability. Captured Comanche warriors reported that separation from their primary weapons caused significant psychological distress, comparable to the loss of a family member. This connection between warrior and weapon explained the lengths to which injured fighters would go to retrieve their equipment, even at considerable personal risk. Blue Duck began moving along the canyon floor, each step sending waves of pain through his injured hip. The Comanche camp lay approximately 17 miles northeast, a distance Blue Duck would normally cover in under 2 hours on horseback. On foot and injured, the journey would require at least 12 hours of difficult travel across rugged terrain. The prospect did not discourage him. Comanche warriors routinely completed forced marches of 30 to 40 miles when necessary, developing physical endurance that European observers frequently noted with astonishment. As he moved through the darkness, Blue Duck's thoughts turned to vengeance. The failure of his attack would require a response that restored both his personal honor and the psychological advantage the Comanche maintained over the Rangers. The specific ranger who had shot him, the one called Call by the others, would become his primary target. This personalization of conflict was common in Comanche warfare, with warriors often developing focused vendettas against specific enemies who had injured or embarrassed them. Such vendettas could continue for years, with some documented cases of Comanche warriors tracking specific adversaries across hundreds of miles and multiple territories to exact revenge. By dawn, Blue Duck had covered nearly 5 miles, his progress slowed by the need to move cautiously and manage his injury. The wound had stabilized somewhat, the bleeding reduced to a slow seepage rather than the steady flow of earlier hours. His determination remained undiminished. The Rangers had won this encounter, but the conflict was far from over. In the broader pattern of Comanche-Texan warfare, such individual engagements represented merely opening moves in a complex strategic game that would continue for decades. As the first light illuminated the eastern horizon, Blue Duck found a secluded overhang where he could rest during the vulnerable daylight hours. Tomorrow night, he would continue his journey to the Comanche camp. And after that, he would return better prepared, more cautious, and absolutely determined to exact his revenge on the Rangers who had humiliated him. Such was the cycle of frontier violence that defined this contested borderland, where personal vendettas blended seamlessly with larger cultural conflicts to create a self-perpetuating pattern of attack and counterattack that neither side could easily escape. Harbingers of war, the dawn of inevitable conflict. Morning light spread across the landscape, revealing the harsh beauty of the frontier territory. The Ranger camp stirred with activity as men prepared for the day ahead, their movements carrying the weight of recent events. The attack by Blue Duck had transformed abstract threat into tangible reality, altering the psychological landscape as significantly as any physical change in terrain. Augustus McCrae sat beside Woodrow Call on a rocky outcropping, overlooking the ravine where their attacker had disappeared. Both men showed signs of the night's vigilance, reddened eyes, stubbled faces, and the slight stiffness that came from hours of tense alertness. "I want to see Clara before I die among these horses," Gus said quietly, breaking the silence between them. The statement wasn't merely romantic sentiment, but represented the complex psychological anchoring that frontier fighters required. Clara Forsyth, a young woman in Austin, had exchanged correspondence with Gus for 3 years, creating a connection to civilization. that sustained him through the isolation of ranger service. Call didn't respond verbally, his attention fixed on the canyon where Blue Duck had escaped. His hand remained wrapped around his Colt revolver, the weapon that had saved his life during the night's attack. The 6-shot Colt represented a significant technological advantage over traditional Comanche weapons, offering rapid-fire capability that could deliver 6 rounds in under 10 seconds, a capability that had shifted frontier power dynamics since its introduction in 1836. Despite this technological edge, Call understood that equipment alone wouldn't determine the outcome of their conflict. The Comanche had adapted to firearms within a single generation, incorporating the weapons into their existing tactical framework while maintaining their superior mobility and terrain knowledge. This adaptability had allowed them to maintain effective resistance despite being outgunned in conventional terms. Captain Scull stood on a small hill overlooking the camp, his silhouette sharp against the morning sky. His posture remained erect despite the night's events, displaying the military bearing ingrained during his formal training. Unlike most frontier commanders who adopted more relaxed postures over time, Scull maintained the disciplined stance that separated him from his men both physically and psychologically. "The Comanche won't win forever," Scull announced, his voice carrying across the camp with practiced authority. "We will destroy them at their roots." The strategy Scull articulated would require years to implement fully, involving coordinated military operations across vast territories. Complete suppression of Comanche resistance would ultimately require the destruction of approximately 5 million buffalo between 1870 to 1880, and the capture or killing of over 30,000 Indian ponies, ecological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Miles away, in the shelter of a sandstone overhang, Blue Duck observed a hawk circling high above. The bird's effortless mastery of the air currents represented the freedom and power that Comanche warriors aspired to emulate. "I will return to kill the one called Call," Blue Duck vowed, the formal phrasing marking this as a sacred oath, rather than merely an expression of intent. Such oaths created binding obligations within Comanche culture, with warriors who failed to fulfill vengeance pledges facing significant loss of status and spiritual standing. The simultaneous preparations of both sides illustrated the fundamental symmetry of the conflict despite their cultural differences. Both the Rangers and the Comanche were adapting their strategies, learning from each encounter, and preparing for escalation. This pattern of mutual adaptation characterized frontier warfare, creating an evolutionary pressure that drove tactical innovation on both sides. The morning's calm belied the certainty of future violence. Watson's death and Blue Duck's attack represented not isolated incidents, but opening moves in an extended campaign. The Rangers' technological advantages would be countered by the Comanche's superior knowledge of terrain and mobility. Scull's strategic vision would be challenged by the decentralized nature of Comanche society, which allowed them to absorb significant losses without collapse. As the Rangers broke camp and prepared to move out, the landscape around them seemed unchanged. Yet the psychological territory had been irrevocably altered. The invisible boundaries between combatants had been redrawn, personal vendettas established, and strategic objectives clarified. What had begun as a routine patrol had evolved into something more significant, a microcosm of the larger conflict that would reshape the American frontier over the coming decades. The sun climbed higher, illuminating both the Rangers moving along the ridgeline and Blue Duck in his hidden shelter. Though separated by distance and culture, they were bound together in a cycle of violence that would continue long after this particular encounter faded from memory. Such was the nature of frontier conflict, personal, cultural, and ultimately transformative for all involved.